Go to the press conference held by the State Council Information Office. We will continue to host a regular briefing on China's economic data. We're glad to be joined by Mr. Fu Linghui, spokesperson of the National Bureau of Statistics and Director General of the Department of Comprehensive Statistics of the NBS. He will brief us on China's economic performance in the first half of 2020 and take your questions. Now I'll give the floor to Mr. Fu. Friends from the media, good morning. I'll first brief you China's major indicators in the first half of this year and answer your questions. Taking strong measures adopted to counter the impacts of unexpected factors and national economy registered a stable recovery. This year faced an increasingly complicated international environment as well as multiple local outbreaks of COVID-19. The economy in the second quarter was under noticeable downward pressure, and the economic development was unusual with significantly increased adverse impacts. Faced with extreme complexities, under the strong leadership of Central Committee of the Communist Party of China with Comrade Xi Jinping at its core, we have deeply implemented the decisions and arrangements made by the CPC Central Committee and the State Council, responded to COVID-19, and pursued economic and social development in a coordinated manner. We step up macro policy adjustments and fully implement a package of stability policies and measures. The resurgence of the pandemic was contained, national economy registered a stable recovery, production and demand saw improving margins, market prices were generally stable, people's livelihoods was sufficiently protected, and momentum for high-quality development was sustained, and the overall social stability was maintained. First, national economy realized positive growth in the second quarter despite downward pressure. Major economic indicators April slumped, faced with new growing downward pressure. We implemented the policy measures of the Central Economic Work Conference and the Government Work Report and rolled out a package of policies to ensure economic stability. A national teleconference on maintaining economic stability was hosted, and policies have soon taken effect. The decline of major economic indicators narrowed in May, and the economy in June registered a stable recovery. The economy in the second quarter achieved positive growth. According to preliminary estimates, the GDP in the first half was over 56,000 billion yuan, up by 2.5% year-on-year at constant prices. By industry, the value added of the primary industry over 2,900 billion yuan, up by 5% year-on-year. The secondary industry, over 22,000 billion yuan, up by 3.2%, and the tertiary industry, over 30,000 billion yuan, up by 1.8%. Specifically, the GDP for Q2 was over 29,000 billion yuan, up by 0.4% year-on-year. And by industry, in Q2, the value added of the primary industry was over 1,800 billion yuan, up by 4.4% year-on-year, and the secondary industry over 12,000 billion yuan, up by 0.9%, and the tertiary industry over 15,000 billion yuan, down by 0.4%. Second, summer grain witnessed another harvest and animal husbandry grew steadily. In H1, the value added of agriculture went up by 4.5% year-on-year, and the overall output of summer grain was over 147 million tons, a 1.4 million tons higher than that of last year, an increase of 1%. The structure of crop farming continued to optimize. In the first half, the output of pork, beef, mutton, and poultry was over 45 million tons, up by 5.3% year-on-year. The output of pork, beef, mutton was up by 8.2, 3.8, 0.7% respectively, and the poultry down by 0.8%. That of milk went up by 8.4% and eggs up by 3.5%. In Q2, the output of pork, beef, mutton, and poultry went up by 1.6% year-on-year. And by the end of second quarter, the number of pigs registered in stock was over 430 million, down by 1.9% year-on-year, among which over 42 million were breeding sows and over 365 million pigs were slaughtered, up by 8.4%. Third, industrial production was steadily recovered and high-tech manufacturing enjoyed fast development. In H1, the total value added of the industrial enterprises above the designated size grew by 3.4% year-on-year. By sector, the value added of mining increased by 9.5%, manufacturing increased by 2.8%, the production of supply of electricity, heat, gas, and water increased by 3.9%. The value added of high-tech manufacturing went up by 9.6%. And by ownership, the value added of the state-holding enterprises grew by 2.7%, shareholding enterprises up 4.8%, enterprises founded by foreign and Macau, Hong Kong, Taiwan investors down by 2.1%, and private enterprises up by 4%. By product, the production of new energy, automobiles, solar cells, and mobile communication base stations grew by over 100%, 31%, and 19% year-on-year respectively. In Q2, the total value added of the industrial prices above the designated size went up by 0.7% year-on-year. In April, down by 2.9%. In May, the negative growth shifted to positive growth, up by 0.7%. In June, up by 3.9%. In June, the PMI stood at about 50% and 0.6 percentage point higher than that of the previous month. The production operation expectation index was above 55% and 1.3 percentage points higher. In the first 5 months, the total profits made by industrial enterprises above the designated size was over 3,400 billion yuan, up by 1% year-on-year. Fourth, service sector recovered gradually, and modern services industries witnessed good momentum and growth. In H1, the value added of services went up by 1.8%. That of information transmission, software and information technology services, and that of financial intermediation grew by 9.2% and 5.5% respectively. The decline in the index of services production in April was narrowed to 5.1% in May, and that in June shifted from decline to an increase of 1.3%. In the first 5 months, business revenue of services enterprises above the designated size went up by 4.6%. And in June, the business activity index for services was 54.3%, 7.2 percentage points higher than that of the previous month. The business activity index for retail sales, railway transportation, road, air transportation, postal services, monetary and financial services, and capital market services stayed within the expansion range of 55% and above. In terms of market expectation, the business activity expectation index for services was above 60%. Fifth, market sales improved and retail sales of goods and for basic living grew fast. In H1, the total retail sales of consumer goods reached over 21,000 billion yuan, down by 0.7% year-on-year. And the retail sales in urban area reached over 18,000 billion yuan, down by 0.8%, and the retail sales in rural areas reached over 2,700 billion yuan, down by 0.3%. And the retail sales of goods was over 19,000 billion yuan, up by 0.1%, and the income of catering was over 2,000 billion yuan, down by 7.7%. The retail sales of grain, oil, food, and that of beverage by enterprises above the designated size went up by 9.9% and 8.2% respectively. The online retail sales totaled over 6,000 300 billion yuan, up by 3.1%, and the online retail sales of goods were over 5,000 billion yuan, up by 5.6%, accounting for 25.9% of the total retail sales of consumer goods. In Q1, the total retail sales of consumer goods down by 4.6%, and in April, that was down by 11.1%. The decline in May narrowed to 6.7%. And in June, this number shifted from decline to an increase of 3.1%, or up by 0.53 percentage point month to month. Sixth, investment in fixed assets continued to grow, and investment in high-tech industries and social sectors grew fast. In H1, the investment in fixed assets reached over 27,000 billion yuan, up by 6.1%. The investment in infrastructure was up by 7.1%, manufacturing up 10.4%, real estate development down by 5.4%, and the floor space of commercial buildings sold reached over 680 million square meters, down by 22.2%. The total sales of commercial buildings were over 6,600 billion yuan, down by 28.9%. By industry, the investment in primary industry up 4%, secondary industry up 10.9%, tertiary industry up 4%, the private investment up 3.5%. The investment in high-tech industries grew by 20.2%, and the investment in high-tech manufacturing and high-tech services increased by 23.8% and 12.6% respectively. The investment in manufacturing of electronic communication equipment and in manufacturing of medical equipment, measuring instruments and meters grew by over 28% respectively. In terms of high-tech services, the investment in services for information of scientific and technological achievements and in R&D and design services up by 13.6% and 12.4% respectively. In second quarter, the investment in fixed assets witnessed an increase of 4.2% year-on-year, and the growth rate was 1.8% in April, 4.6% in May, and rebounded further to 5.6% in June. Seventh, imports and exports of goods grew fast and trade structure continued to optimize. In H1, the total value of trading goods was over 19,000 billion yuan, an increase of 9.4% year-on-year. The total value of export was over 11,000 billion yuan, up by 13.2%. The total value of import was over 8,600 billion yuan, up by 4.8%, and the trade balance was over 2,400 billion yuan in surplus. The import and export of general goods increased by 13.1%, 2.1 percentage points higher than that of the same period last year. The trade by private enterprises increased by 13.6%, accounting for 49.6% of the total value of import and export. And the trade of mechanical and electronic products increased by 4.2%. And in June, the total value of import and export witnessed an increase of 14.3% year-on-year, and the total value of export up by 22%, and the total value of import up by 4.8%. Eighth, consumer price saw mild growth, and growth of producer prices of industrial products continued to decline. CPI went up by 1.7% year-on-year in H1, and the prices for food, tobacco, and alcohol were up by 0.4%, clothing up 0.5%, housing 1.2% up, articles and services for daily use up 1%, transportation communication up 6.3%, education, culture, recreation up 2.3%, medical services and healthcare up 0.7%, and other articles and services up 1.2%. Prices for pork down by 33.2%, grain up by 2.4%, fresh fruit up by 12%, and fresh vegetables up by 8%. Core CPI excluding the prices of food and energy up by 1%. In Q2, the consumer price index went up by 2.3%. The consumer price index increased by 2.1% year-on-year both in April and May, and rose by 2.5% and maintained the same level of growth month-on-month in June. In H1, PPI up by 7.7%, with a year-on-year growth of 6.8% in Q2. PPI grew by 8% in April and 6.4% in May, and up by 6.1% and maintained the same level of growth month-on-month in June. The purchasing prices for industrial producers up by 10.4% year-on-year in H1 and up by 9.5% in Q2. It grew by 10.8% and 9.1% in April and May, respectively, and up by 8.5% and 0.2% month-on-month in June. Ninth, employment improved and surveyed unemployment rate in rural areas went down. In H1, the newly increased employed people in rural areas totaled over 6 million. The surveyed unemployment rate in urban areas averaged 5.7% in H1 and 5.8% in Q2. In April, the surveyed unemployment rate in urban areas was 6.1%. And in June, the surveyed unemployment rate of population with local household registration was 5.3%, and that of population with non-local household registration was 5.8%. The surveyed unemployment rates of the population aged from 16 to 24 and from 25 to 59 were 19.3% and 4.5%. The urban surveyed unemployment rate in 31 major cities was 5.8%, 1.1 percentage points lower than May. The employees of enterprises worked 47.7 hours per week on average. And by end of Q2, the number of rural migrant workers totaled over 181 million. 10th, residents' income increased stably and rural-urban per capita income ratio narrowed. In H1, the nationwide per capita disposable income residents was over 18,000 yuan, a nominal increase of 4.7%, and the real growth was 3%, deducting price factors. The per capita disposable income of urban households was over 25,000 yuan, a nominal increase of 3.6%, and a real growth of 1.9% year-on-year. The per capita disposable income of rural households was over 9,700 yuan, a nominal increase of 5.8%, and a real growth of 4.2%. The nationwide per capita salary income, net business income, net property income, and net income from transfers witnessed a nominal growth of 4.7%, 3.2%, 5.2%, and 5.6% respectively. The per capita income of urban households was 2.55 times that of rural households. It was at 0.06 less than the same period last year. The median of nationwide per capita disposable income was over 15,000 yuan, a nominal increase of 4.5% year-on-year. With these measures taken, the national economy has overcome the adverse impact of unexpected factors, demonstrating momentum of stable recovery, and Q2 witnessed a positive growth. This is no easy achievement. At the same time, we should be aware that the foundation of stable economic recovery is yet to be consolidated due to external and internal factors. Shrinking demand intertwines with disrupted supply, structural problems combines with cyclical problems, and market entities still face difficulties. We will continue to follow the Xi Jinping thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics, faithfully and comprehensively implement the new development philosophy, and coordinate COVID response and economic and social development to fully implement the package of measures to stabilize the economy and constantly consolidate the foundation for a stable economic recovery to keep the major economic indicators within the appropriate range. Now we move on to questions. Please identify yourself before raising questions. First, please. Phoenix TV. In Q2, China's economy was severely hit by COVID. How do you comment on China's economic performance in Q2? Will China continue to sustain the economic recovery?
Thank you for your question. In Q2, due to factors both at home and abroad, the impact on the downward pressure increased. However, thanks to the strong leadership of the CPC Central Committee with Comrade Xi Jinping at its core, various departments have advanced both COVID response and economic development. We have adopted a package of policies and effectively curbed the rebound of COVID. Number one, in Q2, we achieved positive economic growth. Despite the COVID impact in April, we adopted a series of measures to stabilize growth and ensured positive growth. For Q2, it increased by 0.4%. Industry and investment continued to grow. In Q2, industrial growth stood at 0.7%. Fixed asset investment increased by 4.2%. Number two, since May, economic growth continued to pick up. Economic performance dropped in April, but with the easing of the COVID situation in May, the downward trend was curbed, and the economic indicators continue to stabilize. In terms of production, the industrial output increased by 3.9% in June, and the service production index increased by 1.3%. In terms of demand, in June, the total retail sales increased 3.1%. The export was up 22%. In terms of different regions, among the 31 provinces across the country, 21 saw an increase of industrial output, accounting for 67%, and 30 provinces saw an increase of total retail sales, accounting for 96%. Number three, employment and price were basically stable. In Q2, the unemployment rate was 5.8%. In terms of the month performance, in April, the unemployment rate was 6.1%, and the unemployment continued to drop in both May and June. In June, the population between 25 and 59 years old was 4.5%, and the unemployment rate of non-local residents with rural household registration was 5.3%. CPI saw moderate growth. In Q2, CPI was up 2.3%. And price increase in China was significantly lower than the 8% in Europe and the US. Number four, foreign trade was sound and foreign exchange reserve was stable. In Q2, foreign trade increased by 8.1%. And foreign trade increased by 0.1% and 9.6% respectively in April and May, and the growth accelerated to 14.3% in June. Number five, the industry continued to upgrade. Emerging industries saw rapid growth. In Q2, high-tech manufacturing industry grew by 5.7%, and the share of manufacturing industry continued to grow, and the share stood at 28% in Q2. Modern service industry saw rapid growth. In Q2, information transmission and ICT service industry, as well as the financial industry, saw a growth of 7.6% and 5.9% respectively. Generally speaking, in Q2, we overcame various challenges and achieved steady growth. Going forward, despite the negative impact both at home and abroad, the fundamentals for sound growth in China remain unchanged. We have strong resilience and big potential. As we adopt more stabilizing measures, our economy is expected to maintain steady growth. Next question, please. With CGTN, this year we've seen complicated changes both at home and abroad. How do you comment on the economic performance in the first half of the year?
Since the beginning of this year, we see complex changes in international environment. The Ukraine crisis deepened, and multiple outbreaks in China's COVID situation. There have been some fluctuations in China's economy. In the first 2 months, the economic recovery was beyond expectation, and in March and April, affected by international environment and domestic COVID situation and other unexpected factors, major economic indicators saw a significant decline. But since May, we have taken a series of measures to boost the economy, and the COVID situation eases, the economic operation rebounded, and positive changes have been on the rise. First, the economy has overcome difficulties to maintain growth. As I said, the international environment has become more complex and challenging, and the world economic growth has slowed down. The massive COVID situation has posed severe challenges to China's economic stability, especially since April, the economic downward pressure was mounting. Following the decisions and plans of the CPC Central Committee and the State Council, we have taken a package of economic policies and measures and macro policy adjustment to maintain the stability of the economy and achieved positive growth in Q2. In H1, the GDP grew by 2.5%, and in Q2 grew by 0.4%. This is no easy achievement considering the decline of major economic indicators in April and May. This shows China's resilience in economy. Second, the price has maintained overall stability. Affected by geopolitical conflict and the increase of liquidity of major economies in the world, the commodity price, especially energy and food, has maintained on a high level. Against this background, China has ensured the supply and production of food and energy and the stability of price. In H1, the CPI increased by 1.7%, lower than the 3% target annually. And the core CPI, excluding the price of food and energy, was only up by 1%. And the CPI of China was much lower than the 8% in Europe and America, which is conducive to China's stable economic recovery and the improvement of livelihood. Third, about employment. Indeed, the pressure of employment has been mounting, and people have more difficulties to gain more income. But we have seen positive changes. In H1, the newly employed people in rural areas over 6 million. And in May, the surveyed unemployment rate in rural areas saw a decline for consecutive 2 months. And in June, the surveyed unemployment rate in urban areas was 5.5%, a 0.4 percentage point down compared with the previous month. and the residents' income continued to grow steadily. The per capita disposable income nationwide increased by 3%, despite a slightly lower than Q1, but is still faster than GDP growth. Fourth, the resilience of foreign trade. The PMI has stayed above the 50% line, and in H1, the trading goods increased by 9.4% year-on-year. Export increased by 13.2%. In June, the trading goods increased by 14.3% year-on-year and a 4.7 percentage points higher than May. Fifth, economic transformation upgrade continued its momentum. Despite downward economic pressure, China's economic innovation has been leading the growth, and the momentum and new growth drivers continue to emerge. The value-added of high-tech manufacturing by enterprises above the designated size increased by 9.6% year-on-year, and the investment in high-tech industries increased by over 20%. In H1, the value-added of manufacturing accounted by 28.8% of total GDP. And the urban-rural residents per capita income ratio was 2.55, a 0.06 percentage point than that of last year. In H1, the production of solar cells and NEVs stood at 31.8% and over 100%. In general, in Q1, China's economy has shown rebounding momentum. But considering the challenging external environment, there are still some challenges facing in domestic economic recovery. We'll continue to follow the decisions and plans of the CPC, Central Committee, and State Council to fully implement the package policies that stabilizes economic growth to push forward the economic recovery. Next question, please. With Reuters, the GDP growth in H1 was 2.5%. It's much below the 5.5% target. How do you predict the momentum in H2? Will there be more measures to boost economic recovery, in particular with regard to consumption and private investment?
Thank you for your question. In the first half of the year, due to complicated situation abroad and COVID situation at home, economic growth faced some difficulties. Thanks to the joint efforts, we did a successful job in achieving positive growth. Across the world, the risk of stagflation is increasing, and there are some uncertain factors for economic growth. For the first half, going forward, as we adopt more measures to stabilize growth, our economic performance is expected to improve. Number one, as a major country, our economy has big resilience. Despite the shock of COVID, the size of our economy is still big. We have a strong foundation of economic growth and a very big market. In the first half of the year, our GDP reached 56 trillion yuan, and the industrial output reached 20 trillion yuan. The added value of service sector exceeded 30 trillion yuan. Fixed asset investment exceeded 27 trillion yuan, and total retail sales still exceeded 21 trillion yuan. This has increased our confidence to meet various challenges. Number two, we have big potential for the recovery of demand. In terms of investment, we have adopted more measures to stabilize investment. We have issued special bonds and advanced major products. In the first half of the year, infrastructure investment increased 7.1% year-on-year. And the total investment for new projects increased by 22.9%. In terms of consumption, with the improvement of the COVID situation, the offline consumption continued to recover. In terms of foreign trade, our foreign trade has big potential. At the moment, logistics at the ports continue to be ensured, and the foreign trade at the Yangtze River Delta continued to recover. And this has given us a very good foundation to stabilize foreign trade. In May, foreign trade increased 9.5% or 9.4 percentage points higher than April. And in June, foreign trade increased 14.3% or 4.8 percentage points higher than May. Number 3, production recovery has been well supported. In terms of industry, in May, the industrial growth saw positive growth. It was up 0.7%. With the recovery of businesses, the impediments for industrial and supply chains have been removed. In particular, in Q2, those COVID-hit areas saw a rapid recovery of production. In June, PMI returned to above 50%, and the production and operation activity expectation index reached 55%. This shows that the manufacturing business confidence continued to grow. In terms of the service sector, in June, the service output increased 1.3%. In particular, with the accelerated recovery of production and life, service demand will continue to grow. Business confidence will recover. In June, PMI for service sector rose to 54%, and the business expectation index reached 61%. In terms of transport, the cargo transport continued to be ensured, which can support the further recovery of production. The logistic confidence index was 52% or 2.8 percentage points higher than the previous month. Number 4, innovation-driven development has been ensured. In recent years, we promoted innovation-driven development, vigorously promoted industrial transformation and upgrading. In this way, the traditional industries have been expanded to have been promoted with the development of the digital industry and internet industry. Emerging industries have continued to grow. In Q2, high-tech manufacturing industry saw a growth of 5.7%. And the ICT industry saw a growth of 7.6%. Number 5, we've adopted effective macroeconomic policies. In Q2, facing downward economic pressure, the CPC, Central Committee, and State Council adopted 33 policy measures to stabilize growth. In June, the State Council made further arrangements to implement relevant policies. We have seen that infrastructure investment increased significantly, consumer goods consumption recovered, and the business confidence continued to improve. Going forward, as we adopt more measures such as tax refund, issuance of special bonds, we will further promote economic growth. Generally speaking, as the COVID situation further eases and our policy, the impact of our policy will be seen further, and we will further leverage our strength of market size, space and development resilience. In this way, we will continue to promote economic growth. Meanwhile, with the destabilizing and uncertain factors abroad, with the triple pressures at home, we need to make a lot of efforts to ensure economic growth. Thank you. Next question, please. Thank you. With China National Radio, we've noted that some places have been hit hard by COVID. What is the recovery situation, and how do you comment on the performance of different regions? Thank you.
Thank you. In H1, COVID has posed severe challenge to some regions in China. But the impacts are only short-term and temporary, will not change the momentum of economic growth and recovery. In Q2, we see as we coordinate COVID response and the package of economic policies have been implemented, and the regions affected by COVID have rebounded in economic recovery and see positive changes. In Q2, most regions have maintained stability of economy. Of the 31 provinces, cities, and autonomous regions, about 83% of them maintained growth, and the surveyed unemployment rate of 29, lower than the average level. By price, the price increase have been moderate in most regions, and most of them were below 3% target. At Midwest, the GDP in Midwest increased by over 2%. By over 2% faster than the average GDP growth nationwide. And in Midwest, the increase of industrial of the output of industry above the designated price up by 10% and faster than the eastern region. And some regions have been heavily hit by COVID. And in some regions, the economy see a downward pressure, and the unemployment rate saw an increase. For example, in Shanghai and Jilin, the unemployment rate was at over 13.4%, and higher than the national average of unemployment rate. And we also see a rebound in momentum in those COVID-affected regions. As COVID situation eases and companies resume their production and operation, in June, major economic indicators saw significant improvement. In Shanghai and Jilin in June, the value added of industry increased by 13.9% and 6.3%, respectively. And in Jilin, the industrial output continued to increase. And as for the unemployment rate, the Shanghai and Jilin declined by 9.7% and 0.8% respectively. This proves their recovery momentum. In general, most regions in China ensure stability in economy, and Midwest will recover faster than Eastern region. Some regions are facing the temporary impact of COVID, but as they coordinate their COVID response, they have been on the recovery track. Still, the development gap among regions is still there, and we'll continue to coordinate the development strategies among different regions, narrow the development gap among regions, and push for sustained economic growth. Next question, please.
My question is about industrial output. Looking at the headline number, it rose 3.9%. But if you look at the breakdown, according to my calculations, electricity output only rose 0.1%. Rolled steel output fell 3.7%. Cement output fell almost 17%. Plate glass only rose 0.2%. semiconductors fell, cars fell, smartphone production fell. What rose to drive total industrial output up 3.9% when so many industrial goods output fell over the same period? Thank you.
Bloomberg, 彭博对吧 ？From Bloomberg. OK， 请翻译一下。
我们看，是来自彭博社的记者。我们看到了工业生产，今天报告当中所提到的是实现了3.9%的增长，但是根据不同的产品看，根据我个人的估算，其实很多产品的指标都是出现了下滑。我想知道这个3.9%的指标到底是怎么实现和达成的？谢谢。
工业生产来看呢，我们知道呢。
In terms of industrial output,
今年以来呢，受到这个疫情冲击。
This year, due to COVID,
工业生产呢是出现有所下降。
industrial output saw a decrease in April, and it shifted to positive territory in May, and the growth further accelerated in June. In terms of industrial output, we can see that the car industry saw a strong rebound in June because due to COVID situation, car output and production in the Yangtze River Delta dropped. But with the easing of COVID situation in Shanghai and other Yangtze River Delta cities, car output increased significantly. And the production of cars played a very important role in supporting industrial output in June. You talk about some industrial products which saw a decrease. But we are aware that there are over 500 types of industrial products. And most of them saw an increase. So generally speaking, the recovery of industrial output in June is basically supported by equipment manufacturing, particularly car manufacturing. For other types of industries, with the overall economic recovery, they will continue to support the recovery of industrial output. Next question, please.
先这边吧。
谢谢。封面新闻记者提问。
Thank you. With the cover.
24岁的青年人调查失业率创下了新高。
The unemployment rate of 16 to 24 years old population hit a record high. What is your comment on the unemployment situation? And can we deliver on the target of creating jobs? Thank you for your question. We attach great importance to employment, which is a foundation of economic growth. Due to the complicated economic situation abroad and COVID situation at home, we have seen some impact on employment, but with the joint efforts, particularly with the adoption of economic measures, the unemployment rate no longer increase. In April, the unemployment rate was 6.1%. Starting from May, the unemployment rate continued to drop for 2 months, and the unemployment rate was 5.9% or 0.2 percentage point lower than the previous month, and the unemployment rate was 5.5% in June. And there are the following features for employment. Number one, the employment rate was basically stable for the age group between 25 and 59 years old. In June, for this age group, the unemployment rate was 4.5% or 0.6 percentage points lower than the previous month. Number two, the migrant workers saw a sound situation of employment. And the migrant workers mainly work in the heavy industry. and the stability of their employment is not, their employment situation was not very stable. But as we control COVID situation and adopt pro-job measures, their employment situation continued to improve. The unemployment rate was 6.2% and 5.3% for this group in both May and June. Number 3, the young people are facing difficulties in finding jobs. Due to COVID, businesses have been created less for the young people, and the young people are also facing some difficulties due to COVID. Meanwhile, there is a record number of college graduates. In June, the unemployment rate for the people between 16 and 24 years old, the unemployment rate was 19.3%. And we are facing big pressure of unemployment of the young people. We need to adopt more effective measures and implement relevant measures and help them find jobs. Thank you. Next question, please.
那边吧，那边往那边走，对，靠墙有一位记者。
您好，金融时报记者。
With Financial Times, just now you said that in Q2, fixed asset investment continued to improve. Meanwhile, we are aware that cement output saw a drop of 12%. How do you see the contrast? What is your prediction for further infrastructure investment? Thank you for your question.
Indeed, there have been growing amount of interest in infrastructure investment. The investment in manufacturing, infrastructure, and real estate have been the area of most interest to the wider public. The investment in manufacturing grew the fastest in H1, and high-tech manufacturing grew by over 20%. And structure-wise, China is upgrading its industry, and there is a growing momentum that mobilizing more resources toward new industries compared to traditional industries. In general, as China continues to further its upgrade in industry, the equipment manufacturing, high-tech manufacturing will continue to receive more attention and resources. Despite the impact of COVID, the momentum of industrial upgrade remains unchanged in China, and the price level and employment remain stable. So China will continue to further down its path to industrial upgrade. Next question.
这边吧，第3排这位记者。
你好，日本朝日新闻听众。
Asahi Shimbun.
如果没有新冠疫情带来的那个城市公共等影响，中国经济的潜在。
If we can rule out the impact of citywide COVID measures, what is the potential growth of China's economy? And how do you comment on the H2 economic recovery of China contribute to the annual growth target of 5.5%? Is it still possible?
Thank you for your question. In terms of the potential growth rate, some experts have conducted their analysis, Most of them believe that China's potential GDP growth is between 5 to 6%. As our economic size continues to grow, and with bigger restrictions in terms of environment, the potential growth rate will decrease. But generally speaking, across the world, a potential growth rate of 5 to 6% is quite high. In particular, given China's big economic size, such a medium high level of 5 to 6% is not easy to achieve. Our per capita GDP is now over $10,000, but it is still much lower than the $40,000 per capita GDP in advanced economies. This also presents big potential for further economic development. It needs to be pointed out that given the complicated economic situation both at home and abroad and the downward pressure on economic globalization, we are facing a crucial period of economic adjustment and transformation, and we are facing a difficult task to achieve steady economic growth. We need to make painstaking efforts to achieve that. In the first half of the year, we resisted pressure, which is bigger than expected, and achieved positive growth. With rising uncertainties abroad and the triple pressure at home, we're facing challenges in achieving the GDP growth target. Meanwhile, the fundamentals have not changed, and our economic situation is very resilient, and we have strong macroeconomic tools. In the second half of the year, as we advance both the COVID response and economic development, and as we adopt economic stabilizing measures, it is expected that our economy will continue to recover and be maintained at an appropriate range. Going forward, we will continue to promote economic development, advance both COVID response and economic development, and further implement the package policy for stabilized economy. In this way, we will further cement the foundation of economic development and promote its further growth. Thank you. Next question, please. Thank you. With Cover News, we have noted that in June, CPI saw a high level, which is the highest in 2 years. With the upward stage of the pork cycle, will inflation pressure increase in the second half of the year? What pressure will be adopted to keep price at the appropriate range? Thank you for your question. In fact, in recent months, inflation pressure abroad continued to rise, and at home, there are more worries about inflation as well. And as domestic markets continue to recover, and the import of inflation pressure from abroad, we are indeed facing risks of inflation. But still, our inflation in the first half of the year have been kept at a moderate level. In terms of Q2, CPI rose by 2.3%. It was up by 21% in both April and May, and up 2.5% in June. It carries the following features. Due to fresh fruit, egg, and the narrowing of pork price decline, we saw this kind of CPI performance. Number two, industrial output. The price of industrial products expanded. It was up by 4.1% in Q2 as a result of imported price pressure from abroad. In Q2, gas increased by about 30%. Number 3, the service sector. The inflation for the service sector was only 0.8% or 0.5 percentage points lower than Q1. In June, CPI was up 2.5%, mainly because of the low base figure in the previous year, and the carryover effect was 1.2%, and the new factor was just 1.3%. The narrowing of pork price decline contributed to the relative moderate CPI growth. The core CPI was up 1%, or just 0.1 percentage point higher than Q1, which shows that inflation in China was stable, and our inflation rate was much lower than the advanced economies. The reason is that we did not adopt excessive stimulus measures. We've also strengthened grain output. The summer grain saw a bumper harvest. Price stability has ensured stable economic performance and the improvement of people's lives. People are watching closely whether the price rise of pork will contribute to inflation. As a matter of fact, the pork price has returned to the normal level, which would not have a big impact on inflation. And as we adopt more measures, the price will continue to see stable performance. As we reach the flood season, some places may face some pressures in terms of the supply of goods. But as we adopt strong measures to stabilize prices, price stability is expected to be ensured. Thank you. Next question, please. Thank you. With the paper, you said that industrial output accelerated in June. Now we've seen some sporadic COVID cases in some places in China, which has brought new uncertainty to our economic and social recovery. And what is your comment on business recovery and reopening across the country? Thank you.
H1 unexpected factors have resulted to the decline in April. About the value added of the industrial enterprises above the designated size. However, as we took measures, we see continued increase in May and June. And the total value added of the industrial enterprises grew by 3.4% year-on-year. And in Q2, this number went up by 0.7%. In April, down by 2.9%, and in May, shifted from negative to positive and up by 0.7%, and in June was 3.9%. Mining maintained increase. Energy and the supply of energy and stability of supplies have been achieved. The value added of mining increased by 8.4% in Q2. And faster than the average of the total value added of the industrial enterprises as a whole. And the momentum of upgrade has remained unchanged. And in Q2, the value added of high-tech manufacturing increased by 5.7%, faster than the total value added of industrial enterprises. China has a very competitive industry, and the industrial export increased rapidly.
其中6月份增长了15.1%，比上月是加快了4个百分点。
In June, the growth of
那么第四呢是
industrial
中西部地区工业生产
output
持续稳定。二季度东部
was
和
faster
东
than
北
the same
部分
period
地
of
区
last
受
year.
疫情冲击影响
And in
较大，
Q2,
但是
the
中西部地区
northeastern
工业
region
生产总体稳定。
was heavily hit,
支撑了工业
but
的
the
生
mid
产。
and west
二季度
part of China
中部西部
supported the
地区
growth
的
of the
工业
Chinese
生工业增
economy.
加值同比分别增
In
长了
particular, the
5.9%
growth of
6%
industrial output
均快于全国的增速。
and the mid
那
and
么从
western
6月
part
份来看呢，随着
increased
稳
by
增长一系列措施的起效，
5.9%,
工业生产的回升是非常明显的。
increased by 6% faster than the
第一呢，这个
5.9%
多数行业和地
average
区是回
nationwide.
升的。
And most regions and industries
27个行业
maintained
增速
rebounding momentum.
占65.9%。
Of 41 categories, 27,
21个地区规模
that is
以上工业
65.9%,
占67.7%。
maintained growth.
二是装备制造业加快
And
明
of the
显。
31
随着
megacities,
产业链供应
21,
链逐步打通，
that is
汽车生产
67.7% maintained growth.
推动装备制造业的加快。
And equipment
那么6月
manufacturing
份
was one
的
of the
装备制造
highlights.
业的增加值同比增长了9.2%。
The
那么
equipment
比上月是加
manufacturing
快了
in
8.1
June
个百分点，其中
increased
汽车
by
制造业
9.2%,
增长
faster
16.2%，
than the
上月是下
8.1%,
降7%。
and automobile 16.2%,
较大地区的工业
down
生产
by
明
7%
显恢复。
month
6月
to
份
month.
上海、吉林规模以上工业增加值
In
同比
June,
分别增长了13.9%。
in Shanghai and Jilin, the
上月
total
分别是下降
value added of
30.9%
industrial output increased
那么这些情况表明，
by
工业生产稳步
13.9% and
疫情等外部冲击
6.3%
影响逐
respectively.
步消退，生产运转加快改善，对
And
经济
as
支撑
COVID
作用也
situation
增强。
eases, we
产业
see
升
a
级发展态
growing
势持续，有利
amount
于
of supporting
工
role
业
played by
发展的
the
质量提高。
industrial
但也要看
output.
到，目前工业产销衔接不畅，
But still,
问题
there
仍
are
然存在
still
部分行业企业困难较
blocks
多，稳定工业经济
hindering
仍需
the
要持续的
transition
努力。
from supply
下阶
and
段要
sale.
落实好各项
We still need
助企
continued
纾困的
efforts
政策，
to
强
help
化物流保通保畅，
companies out of the
打通产业
difficulties,
链供应链堵点，
ensure
支持
the
企业创
availability
新
of
发展，
supply chains, and
推动
supply
工
the
业生
innovation
产平稳运
development,
行。
innovation-driven development of companies and industries.
那我们最后一个问题吧。
Thank you. Last question.
谢谢主持人。每日经济新闻记者提问。
Daily
4
economic
月份我
news.
国社零总额同比增速
In
达到今
April,
年上半
the
年以来的低点。此后5
growth
月、6
of
月出现反弹
retail
趋
sales
势
of consumer
那么这
goods
是否意味
hit
着
the
今
low
年消
point
费
in
微自
H1.
行的拐点
Then we
已经
see
过去
a
消
rebound
费的迅
in
速反弹
May
是
and
否与
June.
多地启动消费
Does
券
this mean that we
去
have
刺激有
passed
关
the V-shaped
国家统计局
turning
如何
point
预
of
判下
consumption
半
this
年
year?
的消费趋势？
How do you predict consumption in the next
大家
half
对消
of the
费
year?
问题也是比较关注。
Thank you for your
内
question.
的这个多方
I
面
know
影
that
响
we are watching
消费
consumption very closely due to multiple factors. Consumption has been affected in the first half of the year due to sporadic
市场销售
COVID
呢是出现
cases.
下滑，特别是服务消费呢回落是比较明
Market
显。
consumption
那么上半年呢，社会消
dropped
费流动总额呢是同比下降了
significantly.
0.7%。
Total retail
但是
sales
5月份以来呢，
was
随着
down
疫情反弹得到控制，促消费
0.7%,
政策
but
起效呢，
since
市场
May,
销售呢是稳步回升。
as we
那么5月份的
as
社
the
零
COVID
总额
situation
呢，同比
eases
下降了
and our
6.5%，
policies have taken effect,
6.7%，降幅是收窄了4.4个百分点。那么6月份呢，
in
增
May,
速转正，
the
同比
decline
增
of total retail sales
那么从
was
上半年情
curbed
况来看呢，
and
市场
it
销售呢
turned
主要是以
positive
下几
in
个特
June.
点。第一
There
呢
are
是这个
the
基本
following
生活消费
features in
较
total retail sales.
上半
Number
年呢，
one,
粮油食品类、饮料类的零售额呢，
food
同比分别
beverage
增长了9.9%、
consumption
8.2%。
increased by 9.9 and 8.2% respectively, which has supported
二
people's
是网
normal
上零
lives.
售稳
Number
定增
two,
长。
online
上半
sales
年实
continue
物
to
商品网
grow.
上零售额
In the
同
first
比
half
增
of
长
the year, online
5.6%，
sales
占社会消费
was
零
up
售总额比重呢达到
5.6%, accounting
25.9%。
for 55.9% of the total. Number three,
受疫情冲击
service
影响的服务
consumption
消费呢
dropped
下降明显。
due to
上
COVID.
半年
Service
呢，
consumption
餐饮收入同比
decreased
下降了
significantly.
7.7%。
Catering industry
那么
was
居民旅
down
游出行服务消费
7.7%.
呢也有所
Tourism
减少。
consumption
但是从6月
decreased
份
as
情况来
well.
看呢，应该
But
说呢，
in June,
国内市场销售呢还是出现了积极的变
market
化。
sales
一是
in the
多数商
country
品
saw some
零
positive
售增
changes.
速呢是回
Number
升。
one,
那么
most
6月份
products
18类
saw a
线和以
rebound
上
of
商品出口额
consumption.
当中呢，
Among the 18 types of products, nearly 90% saw an increase over the previous month. In particular, food and clothing saw a big increase. Meanwhile, ICT products and cosmetics saw an increase of 6.6% and 8.1% respectively. Number two, due to the policies such as related to car industry, the home appliance and car consumption increased significantly. In June, car consumption, home appliance consumption increased by 13.9% and 3.2% respectively, much higher than the previous month, and has contributed to the increase of total retail sales. Number three, the consumption of catering also increased. In June, catering industry dropped by about 4%, but that was 17 percentage points narrower than the previous month. Number five, consumption in COVID hit areas increased. Consumption in COVID hit areas saw a sound picture. In particular, in Shanghai and Jilin, the situation is turning for the better. Generally speaking, consumption is showing a momentum of improvement with more positive changes. And meanwhile, we're still facing some pressure and challenges in recovering consumption. But China's trend for consumption upgrading still remained, and China's consumption is expected to maintain a stable performance. Thank you very much. This is the end of this press conference. Bye-bye.